let's talk a little bit about an independent
Sure.
Scotland. On the current figures, you'd start off with a 6% in the red deficit problem.
Well,
That's quite substantial.
Indeed, and I should say, first of all, that deficit is a feature of how we're governed right now, which is by Westminster. It's not a reflection of life in an independent Scotland.
It's a reflection of the strength of the Scottish economy. And the reason I'm asking about it is the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and you know what I'm going to say, their report on an independent Scotland. Let me read it out. Pursuing the type of policies suggested in the SNP manifesto in an independent Scotland would mean either cuts would have to be even bigger or taxes would have to be increased. And they say, in the short term at least, independence would likely necessitate more, not less austerity.
I do have a great deal of respect for the IFS. I think on that in particular, what they are missing here is actually one of the key objectives and points of independence in an economic sense. It's about getting your economy growing faster so that Scotland would be able to emulate the economic performance of similarly sized countries that actually don't have the assets we've got. But on the deficit, let me complete the point on the deficit, because Scotland's deficit is reducing. We did a piece of work as the SNP that projected what the deficit might be in 2021. The deficit now is already lower than that projection because our onshore revenues have been rising. Actually, in the most recent year, Scotland's onshore revenues increased at a faster rate than the rest of the UK's. Our economy is strong. What holds us back right now is not having all the levers of independence that other countries take for granted.
Well, you say that, but a lot of this is about exporting. That's where a country earns its place in the world. And you've been very, very critical of Brexit because 18% of Scottish exports go to the EU. And the problems have been caused by that. Scotland didn't vote for that. I understand that.
Well, on exports, because it's an important point, we had some statistics out in Scotland just this week on exports. Scottish exports are growing faster than the rest of the UK's. Our exports to Europe are growing faster. Now, if you look at the position...
I'm sorry. Okay. Here is the question. 18% go to the EU. You're very cross about Brexit. But 60% go to England and Wales.
And I don't want to change it.
In an independent Scotland, particularly if you're part of the EU, there's going to have to be some kind of border between Scotland inside the EU, if that's what happens, and England and Wales outside. It's inevitable. It's a 95-mile border between the Solway Firth and...
Just answer that question directly, because it's a really important question, and I have resolved to be absolutely frank with people. Independence, my proposition, is not what necessitates borders. That is Brexit. Now, right now, sitting here right now, we don't yet know what the final relationship between the UK and the EU will be. I want it to be as close as possible. I still hope the UK can stay in the EU. When we know what that final relationship will be, I will consider and set out clearly if there are implications for Scotland and how we intend to deal with and mitigate those implications.
Because people should understand that under your plans, this is not the Scottish border or the English border. This is the external border of the EU.
It's not under my plans, Andrew. It's under the Brexit plans, to be absolutely clear about it. But let me say, I want to, and there's no reason why Scotland would not continue to trade with England and vice versa. But I don't think Scotland should lose out on free trade within the single market, which is 8 times bigger than the UK market. And if you take the example of Ireland, when Ireland was able to combine the benefits of independence with the benefits of EU membership, what happened is that Ireland's exports base diversified. They started to export more to Europe, and actually they became a more prosperous country. So Scotland shouldn't be in the invidious position of having to choose between the two. We should be actually aiming to have the best of both worlds.
Other times, but nonetheless, that border will be an external border of the EU, and there is no way
you're making assumptions about the final relationship between the UK and the EU. You might be right in terms of what you said about that relationship. Well, but we don't know the outcome of the general election yet. We don't know whether the UK is definitely leaving the EU. If it is, we don't know what the future relationship is going to be. Now, I will continue to argue for that to be as close as it possibly can be, and I will be very clear and frank with people about any implications for Scotland, and crucially how I and the SNP and the Scottish Government would seek to mitigate and to deal with those implications so that there aren't barriers to trade between Scotland and the rest of the UK. And I should be clear here, we're talking about goods and services. In terms of people, the common travel area is already accepted. That will continue.
You've just come down from Aberdeenshire, I think, where you've been campaigning lots and lots of marginal constituencies up there. Have you been frank with the Scottish fishing community that under your plans you will not be able to reform the common fisheries policy?
We have, no, we have been long-term advocates of reform of the common fisheries policy. In the days when the Conservatives were taking the UK into the common fisheries policy, treating fishing as expensive defendable in the wider interests of the UK. The SNP has been arguing for reform of the common fisheries policy, but what we've always been also been frank with the fishing community about, which the Tories haven't, is that yes, more control over Scottish waters is important, but so too is being able to process our fish. Our fish processors rely on a lot of migrant labour, and also being able to sell our fish into markets.
Let's come back to the common fisheries
all
policy.
of that.
Let's just come back to the common fisheries policy. However, under your plans, Scotland will be part of the EU. Will have 1% of the EU's total population and 6 out of 751 MEPs. 6 out of 751. How is Scotland going to force big countries to change their fishing policy?
Well, people say, how do small countries force change in the European Union? You only have to look at Ireland over the last wee while to see how a small country can command total solidarity and support from the European Union. Small countries actually have a lot of influence in Europe, and the position you just outlined you outlined that position, and I understand why, fairly pejoratively, but right now Scotland doesn't have seats at the top table in the European Union. We have to rely on the UK government, which sometimes represents our interests, sometimes doesn't, because the interests diverge between Scotland and the UK. So actually having a government in there fighting for Scotland's interests all the time, whether that's on fishing, on agriculture, or anything else, it would be a major step forward for Scotland, and we'd be in the position of these other powerful, influential, small independent countries.